The Siberian wind arrives before anything else, before the sun, before the sound of passing trucks, before the faint voices of workers rising for the day. It sweeps across the endless fields of white, whispering stories buried beneath snow that never fully melts. Somewhere within this frozen wilderness lies a mystery that has remained hidden from most of the world. Small towns where Filipino immigrants built homes, carved out communities, and learned to survive a land that offered nothing soft, nothing gentle, only a cold that tested every breath. The story begins more than 2 decades ago, when a wave of overseas workers left the Philippines in search of opportunity. Contracts were scarce in the Middle East. Europe was becoming stricter, but Russia, specifically the far-flung industrial regions of Siberia, opened its doors. Jobs were plentiful: construction, oil fields, metal factories, shipping yards. What they lacked in comfort, they made up for in wages that could change a family's future back home. Flights landed in Novosibirsk, Irkutsk, and Krasnoyarsk, carrying men and women who had never seen snow before. When the airport doors slid open, the cold wrapped around them like a shock, sharp, metallic, almost alive. Many later said that in that moment they questioned everything. But they stayed, because they had to. Soon, clusters of Filipino workers began renting rooms close to factories, sharing meals, pooling money for heat during brutal winters. Over time, these clusters expanded into neighborhoods. Neighborhoods became communities. And in some towns, the Filipino presence became so strong that locals gave the areas nicknames like Malit na Maynila, Barangay Snow, and Pinoy Street. Most people outside Russia never heard about these places. They never knew about the Filipino karaoke nights echoing in wooden apartments, or the smell of adobo drifting into Siberian hallways, or the makeshift sari-sari stores hidden in storage buildings behind factories. They never knew that in a land where temperatures sometimes plunged to 40 degrees, a warmth survived, a warmth carried by immigrants who refused to disappear. To understand their story, you have to follow the footsteps of the earliest arrivals. Construction sites were the heart of the first Filipino towns. Men worked 12 hours a day, shoveling snow before they could even begin their real tasks. By night, they huddled near heaters that groaned under the weight of the cold. And yet, in these harsh conditions, friendships formed quickly. Russians were surprised by the Filipinos, by their humor, their resilience, the way they sang even after a day that would break most people. Many locals, curious and intrigued, began visiting Filipino gatherings. Some married into the community. The cultures blended imperfectly at first, but beautifully over time. One of the earliest settlements formed near a mining town where the sun barely rose during winter. Workers remembered how their shadows stretched for only minutes before dissolving into gray. In those months of darkness, the Filipinos kept light alive through tradition. Christmas lanterns made from scrap plastic glowed in kitchen windows. Simbang gabi was improvised in cramped rooms lit by phone flashlights. Families back home watched video calls in awe, seeing their relatives bundled in layers of clothes, breath fogging the screen, snow piling against the doors. But not all stories were filled with comfort. Some workers disappeared into the endless whiteness after failed contracts or expired papers. Others were trapped by employers who withheld wages, knowing their workers had nowhere else to go. A few vanished entirely. Rumors whispered of accidents on remote sites, of bodies never recovered from frozen rivers, of names that faded before anyone could tell their stories properly. Still, the towns grew. Over the years, Russian children with Filipino parents began to fill classrooms. Their teachers described them as warm, gentle, and hard-working, traits inherited from both worlds. They spoke Russian fluently but understood Tagalog, and on weekends their parents taught them the dances and songs of a homeland they had never seen. By the late 2010s, the Filipino communities had become self-sustaining. Grocery deliveries arrived monthly from Moscow, bringing bagoong, sinigang mix, pancit canton, and dried fish. A small chapel was built illegally inside a warehouse, blessed quietly by a visiting priest who pretended he was just a tourist. The community fund grew strong enough to support newcomers, pay for emergency medical care, and send home pasalubong boxes during holidays. Yet even as these towns thrived, a silence settled over them, because they existed in the shadow of uncertainty. Immigration laws shifted often, contracts were unstable, and the pandemic threatened to scatter everything the community had built. Some towns were wiped out entirely when factories closed. Others grew even stronger as more Filipinos arrived, desperate for work. But one town, perhaps the most mysterious of all, claimed to hold the deepest secrets. Rumors said dozens of undocumented Filipinos lived there, hidden from authorities, protected by locals who had grown to love them. It was said that when strangers visited, the Filipinos vanished into the back rooms of wooden houses or slipped quietly into forests the moment unfamiliar footsteps approached. Their lives became ghost-like, real yet unseen, present yet hidden. And this is where the trail leads us next. But before we continue deeper into the untold history of these Siberian immigrant towns, if you're finding this documentary fascinating, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next part takes us into places few outsiders have ever been allowed to see. Your support helps us uncover more stories the world has forgotten. As the wind grows colder and the road narrows into a forest of silent pines, we arrive at the edge of the most secretive Filipino settlement in Siberia, a place the locals simply call the village that should not exist. According to workers who once lived here, something happened one winter, something that changed everything, something still whispered about in fear. And as we prepare to walk toward the first snow-covered house, the only question that remains is this: what exactly happened in that hidden Filipino town? And why do the survivors refuse to speak about it? The road to the hidden Filipino settlement narrows until it becomes nothing more than a trail carved by footsteps. Footsteps that have been retraced for decades by the same families who chose to live far from the reach of anyone who might ask too many questions. Snow crunches under every step, and the wind grows harsher, as if warning visitors to turn back. Ahead, faint shapes emerge through the frost. Wooden houses leaning slightly from age, smoke trailing from chimneys, and windows covered by thick curtains that hide more than just cold. Locals say this village was never meant to exist. It wasn't in any census report, not on any immigration registry, not even on municipal maps. It formed quietly, almost accidentally, when a group of undocumented Filipino workers fled a factory shutdown that left them stranded with no legal papers and no money to return home. Too ashamed to tell their families and too afraid to approach authorities, they followed the guidance of Russian friends who led them deeper into the forest, a place where nobody asked who you were, only whether you could survive the cold. Inside the settlement, the first thing you notice is silence. Heavy, watchful, almost protective. Doors open only slightly, revealing eyes that scan strangers before letting them any closer. The few who allow interviews speak gently, choosing words carefully, as though telling their story might summon the ghosts of their past. The elders describe their first winter here as the hardest season of their lives. They built cabins out of scrap wood, insulated them with old blankets, and used small iron stoves to battle temperatures that dipped below 40 degrees. Food was scarce, work was nearly non-existent, and every day carried the fear of discovery. Yet even in the bleakest conditions, the Filipino spirit refused to fade. They organized weekly gatherings around a fire pit, cooking rice in battered pots and heating whatever vegetables or canned goods they could find. Someone always sang, even if only to break the darkness creeping into their hearts. Someone always prayed, believing that if faith could survive here, so could they. Over time, the settlement grew. Babies were born and raised alongside Russian children. Gardens were carved out of frozen soil using techniques borrowed from local Siberian families. The community became a blend of cultures: Filipino resilience wrapped in Russian toughness, Tagalog lullabies floating through forests of birch and pine. But the harmony didn't last forever. One winter, a tragedy struck that changed the village forever, an event survivors still struggle to discuss openly. It began when a nearby river froze unevenly after weeks of unpredictable temperatures. Several workers attempted to cross it to reach a regional market. The ice cracked without warning, swallowing two of them beneath the current. Their bodies were never found. The loss shattered the community. Children grew afraid of the river. Elders whispered prayers every night. And the undocumented workers, terrified that authorities would investigate, hid their grief in silence. From that moment on, the villagers refused to register their existence with the government. They lived in the shadows not only out of fear, but out of loyalty to the memory of those they lost. This tragedy became the turning point that shaped everything the village became afterward. The people hardened, not in spirit, but in caution. They trusted only those who had proven themselves. Outsiders were tolerated but not embraced. And the town remained invisible, protected by the forest and by the promise that no one would be left behind again. As years passed, whispers of the settlement spread. Some Russians spoke of the kind Filipino workers who repaired machinery in exchange for food. Others mentioned the strange but warm town hidden beyond the river. But the stories were always vague, always half-imagined, as though the village were drifting between myth and reality. Modern times brought new challenges. Authorities increased border checks. Employers demanded tighter identification requirements. Political tensions between Russia and Western countries created stricter surveillance. In these moments, the Filipino settlement faced the real possibility of disappearing forever, its people forced to scatter, its stories lost. And yet, instead of fading, the community adapted. Younger residents learned Russian law. They connected with churches in nearby cities. Some even negotiated temporary work arrangements for elders who could no longer travel far. Slowly, cautiously, the village began stepping out of the shadows. Not fully, but enough to breathe easier. One of the most astonishing sights in the settlement appears on Sunday mornings, when families gather in a small clearing for Mass. A wooden table becomes a makeshift altar. Candles flicker despite the wind. Voices rise together, singing hymns that once echoed across warm Philippine shores, but now float between ancient Siberian trees. It is a reminder that identity survives even in the coldest places on Earth. The younger generation tells a different story, one of struggle but also of belonging. Many of them have never seen the Philippines, yet they carry the culture deeply. They speak Russian outside, but switch to Tagalog or Visayan at home. They cook sinigang with local fish, pancit with Russian cabbage, and adobo using whatever vinegar they can find. Their lives are proof that heritage bends, but does not break. As the global Filipino diaspora continues to grow, these Siberian immigrant towns remain some of the least documented, least understood communities in the world. Yet they offer a powerful lesson that a people known for warmth can survive even the harshest cold and reshape it into something human. For travelers brave enough to reach these places, the welcome is surprisingly warm. Children run across snowy paths, laughing as they tug visitors toward their homes. Elders offer tea infused with herbs gathered from the forest. Stories unfold slowly but generously, like pages of a book long hidden in a drawer. And in those moments, the isolation melts away. You realize that these towns are not just settlements. They are monuments to endurance, culture, and unspoken unity. But the future remains uncertain. Climate change is altering Siberia's ecosystems. Factories are closing. Immigration rules grow stricter every year. And the village that should not exist now stands at a crossroads. Reveal itself and risk exposure, or remain hidden and risk extinction. Yet when asked what they fear most, the people here answer with surprising clarity. They fear being forgotten. They fear that their sacrifices, their survival, their quiet victories will vanish if no one tells their story. They fear that the children growing up in these forests will lose the connection to a homeland they may never walk upon. And above all, they fear that the world will never understand how much they endured just to stay together. Which is why sharing this story matters. If you're still watching, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it so more people can learn about the hidden Filipino towns that defied the Siberian cold and carved their place in history. Before we end, there is one question left, one that only you, the viewer, can truly answer. Should these Filipino immigrant towns remain hidden for their protection, or should their story finally be told openly to the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could shape how this forgotten chapter of history is remembered.